Before Thomas Plummer vanished from Earth, one threat from Thomas's father drove him into the London hospital. Disinheritance. Broad-shouldered, fashionable, and perfectly healthy, he treated medical training as another inconvenience wealth ought to soften. He cultivated elegant excuses, avoided unpleasant duties, and preserved a comically confident opinion of his own promise. Then, in the tiled operating room, steel met flesh, and Thomas's practiced composure vanished with his color. His knees loosened, his broad frame collapsed before the watching students, an air brought low by reality. Consciousness returned quickly, together with the humiliating certainty that opening his eyes would require an explanation. So Thomas lay motionless, breathing carefully, while concern gathered around the supposedly senseless young gentleman. His performed helplessness left him entirely vulnerable to anyone prepared to discover whether he truly slept. Thomas's counterfeit collapse, meant to spare him embarrassment, instead invited Zumina to propose a treatment far more alarming than any hospital reprimand. With clinical calm, she suggested curare, then spoke of observing its effects upon his supposedly insensible body. Thomas sprang upright, all illness forgotten, and struck her assistant before the experiment could begin. Zumina neither recoiled nor apologized. Behind her dark glasses, she coolly explained that the threat had merely tested whether he was shamming. Questions followed, and Thomas, indignation yielding to vanity, disclosed he was Thomas Plummer, wealthy heir to his father's pill manufacturing fortune. Mistaking her composure for professional admiration, Thomas straightened his coat and demanded the respect owed to his station. Her scrutiny changed at once. The cowardly patient was wealthy, vain, and physically exceptional, a combination worth keeping close. Having discovered the vanity beneath Thomas Plummer's bluster, Zumina cultivated him at London Hospital with cool, deliberate friendliness. Whenever they met, day after day, she praised his broad shoulders, healthy frame, and splendid physical proportions, observations he received with growing delight as richly deserved admiration. Her brick-red skin, fine facial down, dark glasses, and strangely foreign speech briefly puzzled him, but never enough to disturb his pleasure. Zumina's exact questions about his strength and health sounded clinical. Thomas Plummer, serenely self-satisfied, heard only the language of attraction. Soon enough, their walks through sooty London became habitual, with Thomas Plummer displaying fashionable confidence while Zumina watched him through unreadable lenses. Thus, when she invited him to her private lodging at Berk Place, he followed eagerly, never wondering why her courtship resembled an examination. Chasing imagined romance, Thomas entered the summer house behind Berk Place, where Zumina poured champagne beside padded machinery. He drank eagerly, mistaking her attention for desire, while she watched him and quietly tested the levers. "Shut the door," she said, with the calm authority he had already learned to obey. Thomas swung it closed. Metal met metal, the latch seated, and the chamber sealed around them. There was no jolt, no wheel noise, no sense of speed, only Zumina's fingers moving once across the fittings. Then she raised her glass, regarding him through dark glasses with playful composure. "You are millions of miles from London," Zumina announced. "We are already within the atmosphere of Venus." Because nothing had moved, Thomas clutched disbelief like a railing and demanded that she open a scuttle and show him proof. Zumina met Thomas's denial without argument. She unfastened a scuttle and drew him toward the impossible daylight beyond its glass. Below, flowers rose like cathedral towers, violet undergrowth heaved, and monstrous creatures wandered among stems thicker than London chimneys. Thomas recovered his vanity and declared the spectacle Zumina's magnifying contrivance, built to frighten a man whose scientific wits remained sound. Zumina touched the levers, and the transit car sank 50 feet through blazing air before settling with a soft, final jar. The door opened. Thomas stepped boldly out, plunged ankle-deep into boiling violet moss, recoiled screaming, then looked upward into a white sun that stabbed his eyes. As he staggered back, Zumina calmly told him he was sober, awake, and truly on Venus, leaving him no choice but to follow his only guide. Among forms he could not name, Thomas clung to Zumina as his only guide. She led him along an emerald road beneath colossal flowers toward burrow-like openings in the ground. Below, Venus City unfolded through glowing tunnels and domes, crowded with brick-red Sutenra and towering winged Thothene. Thomas searched each alien face for reassurance, but Zumina took him into a strange house and turned away. "You amuse me," she said, "but science has the greater claim upon your body." She departed before he could plead, leaving him alone amid low couches and dim lamps. Then a 7-foot Thothene emerged and spoke clearly, its expressive horned eyes fixed directly upon Thomas. Its flexible trunk touched him gently and guided him through a curtained doorway, proving that Zumina's betrayal had delivered him to an intelligence beyond denial. From the darkness came a woman's groan, proof that Thomas was not the only prisoner in the house. Phyllis Olsen stepped into the lamplight and warned him that their captors intended a death no earthly imagination could properly conceive. Then, with fragile brightness, she proposed a tour of Venus City, because movement was kinder than waiting. In the captive's house, Reverend Winwood met them gravely and asked Thomas whether he understood what awaited him. Thomas did not. Winwood answered that the Thothene were neither fable nor beasts, but mighty minds the Sutenra could not own. He introduced F, whose towering winged form and watchful horned eyes made intelligence undeniable. Yet Thomas heard the warning as an insult to courage, not yet as the map of power it truly was. Phyllis repeatedly hid behind curtains when Sutenra passed, her terror goading Thomas into reckless swagger. Thomas struck a towering Thothean's trunk, and a blue electrical shock instantly dropped him senseless. The Thothene bore him to Zumina, who examined him with cool contempt. Afterward, she pronounced Thomas normal, explaining that his brain was merely inactive by nature. She named the Sutenra descendants of ancient Egyptians, whose pyramid-linked transit cars crossed worlds instantly. They collected Earth bodies as specimens, seeking resistance to sunlight, which killed their kind. The Thothean resisted Sutenra rule, and Zumina admitted that open war might be near. Madness could no longer protect Thomas. Intelligent captors truly meant to use the captives' bodies. He could only face Zumina's personal decision about what would be done to his own. Now Zumina made the threat personal. Thomas must either mate with her or surrender himself to science. Horrified by the imagined marriage, he drew himself up and grandly chose science. She regarded him with startled admiration, praising his sacrifice and promising that anesthetics would soften the work. Only then did Thomas understand. Science meant his living body opened beneath Sutenra instruments. Panic erased dignity. He declared sudden love for Zumina and begged to reconsider. Her composure never shifted. Detecting the lie, she withdrew the anesthetics and ordered every experiment performed without mercy. Thomas hurled an insult, then crawled towards the captive's house, expecting the contempt he knew he deserved. Instead, Phyllis met his return with silent sympathy, and that unexpected mercy stopped him where boasting had failed. Thomas's self-contempt faltered when Phyllis Olsen, offering no reproach, quietly took his trembling hand in the dim room. He wanted to snatch it away, yet her steady blue-eyed sympathy slowed his breath until panic loosened its grip. Reverend Winwood then explained that every meal brought to the captive's house purchased merely one more day before the Sutanrar experiments began. In a low voice, Phyllis told how a false employment advertisement had lured an orphan seeking honest work into captivity on Venus. Her trust wounded him more sharply than Zumina's contempt, and before courage could object, Thomas declared that he already possessed a plan of escape. Hope brightened Phyllis's fearful stillness. Reverend Winwood studied Thomas gravely, and the lie became a promise he could no longer abandon without betraying her. When Reverend Winwood left them alone, the hush that followed drew Thomas Plummer and Phyllis Ulson beyond gratitude into a trembling confession of love. For one brief moment, the captive's house seemed less a prison than a sanctuary, and Phyllis's quiet happiness made Venus itself recede. Then Thomas, searching his clothes, found his forgotten revolver still loaded, and hope flashed through him with a darker companion. If escape failed and the Sutanrar came to torture Phyllis, he vowed to use the final shot to spare her their knives. She neither recoiled nor doubted him. Instead, she said his cleverness would surely discover escape before such mercy became necessary. Her absolute faith shamed his old cowardice, turning a lover's boast into calculation as Thomas began seeking not a merciful death, but a road to life. His promise to Phyllis hardened into a route. Reach the distant Venus pyramid, seize a transit car, then return for her and Reverend Winwood. Winwood warned that every earlier fugitive had fallen to blinding daylight, the monstrous country, or nameless dangers. Thomas insisted darkness offered a chance, although his confidence sounded thinner in the quiet house. Asked whether capture should end in suicide, Winwood refused. Life and death, he said, belonged to God. Thomas bowed, yet privately resolved that if the Sutanrar raised their knives, his revolver would give Winwood a quicker mercy. Then Winwood named F, a Thothian opposition leader, and Thomas saw a possible ally against Sutanrar cruelty. He would warn the Thothian, seek their help, and begin at twilight, while lethal sunlight sealed every doorway. At last, twilight thinned the murderous glare, and Thomas Plummer crept to the tunnel mouth to search the dim horizon. Beyond the violet moss, distant pyramids rose like black teeth, fixing the direction of his desperate gamble. He drew Thomas's revolver, waited for the last white fire to fade, then stepped alone from shelter with a courage he scarcely recognized as his own. Each stride across the springing violet carpet carried him farther from Phyllis Ulson, Reverend Winwood, and every safe retreat. Inside the nasturtium grove, gigantic, overlapping leaves swallowed the sky. Tangled stems turned his chosen line into a blind, breathless maze. Then immense artificial lamps burst alive overhead, bleaching every shadow, erasing the pyramids, and proclaiming that a conflict greater than his escape had begun. The failed path from the nasturtium grove spilled Thomas into the first violence of the revolt. He crawled among wounded and dead Thothene as blue electrical fire jumped between trunks and winged bodies fell. A fleeing figure struck him, and Thomas, wild with rage, bore the captive down and closed both hands upon her throat. Then her dark glasses shifted, revealing Zumina, and he released her, unable to choose the deliberate killing of a woman. Composed, Zumina offered immunity to Thomas, Phyllis Alson, and Reverend Winwood if he carried her back to Venus City. Thomas accepted only the bargain and dragged her through bursting arcs, falling Thothene, and showers of burning leaves. He hauled Zumina into the Venus City tunnel, where Mercy had won a promise that war and her nature might yet destroy. As Thomas brought Zumina back into Venus City, he believed her promised immunity had purchased survival. Zumina reported the Allied army annihilated, adding calmly that whichever side prevailed would still need doctors. At the captive's house, Thomas repeated that promise to Phyllis Ulson, trying to make the bargain sound unbreakable. Phyllis clasped her hands, thanked God, and smiled through tears as though deliverance had already entered the room. Reverend Winwood's grave eyes stopped Thomas's celebration. No promise from the Sutanra was safe, he warned. Defeat would only hasten their sunlight experiments upon the captives. Thomas and Reverend Winwood wrestled with escape, but earthward travel seemed impossible to explain reliably to the superior Thothean. Before either man found an answer, the lamps trembled, and electrical pressure gathered beyond the refuge walls. Winwood's warning became fact when a scream tore Phyllis from sleep. In her dream, the Sutanra had already entered. Thomas calmed her, then ventured into the corridor, where one of the Thothene stood rigid beneath the lamps, frozen dead. Its horned eyes stared blindly, and cold terror settled over the captive's house. Returning to Phyllis, Thomas abandoned caution and asked her to marry him at once. Wonder, fear, and tenderness crossed her face. Before she could answer, she fainted into his arms. Blue fire burst from the walls, lamps exploded, and invisible force flung Thomas, Phyllis, and Winwood across the room. Sparks rained through sudden darkness as all three lay senseless, stripped of shelter, weapons, and time. When consciousness returned, Thomas's revolver was emptied, and Winwood's selection left them less than an hour to act. When consciousness returned, Thomas found Phyllis and Reverend Winwood stirring beside him, while smoke curled from Thomas's revolver. The electrical surge had fired every cartridge without aim, leaving their last defense useless. Reverend Winwood quietly urged them to marry at once, and Phyllis answered Thomas with a steady yes. Then Reverend Winwood indicated the untouched table. No breakfast had been brought for him. That omission, he explained, meant the Sutanra would take him for experimentation before another day passed. Thomas searched couches, corners, and clothing for a loose cartridge or hidden weapon, but found nothing. Before the dim lamps, Reverend Winwood placed Phyllis's mother's ring in Thomas's hand and solemnly joined their vows. As he spoke the final blessing, footsteps gathered beyond the curtain, and the Sutanra entered to claim him. The blessing had scarcely ended when Zumina and the Sutanra swept in, turning sanctuary into capture. Thomas lunged at Zumina, but one of the Thothean pinned his arms and crushed his furious resistance. Though trembling, Phyllis proudly answered Zumina. Thomas Plummer is my husband." Zumina went to claim Reverend Winwood, only to find the gentle clergyman dead beyond her instruments. At her order, the Sutan-Ra bound cloth across Phyllis's blue eyes and carried the newlyweds into the laboratory prison. "Accept my congratulations upon your honeymoon," Zumina told Thomas, her composed face making the cell seem crueler. Later, as Phyllis slept, Thomas bent over her, wondering whether death by his hands was kinder than the laboratory. But he drew back. He could not destroy the life he had sworn to protect, and waited for Zumina. When Zumina returned and opened the cell, Thomas sprang from despair into the one chance her nearness offered. He caught her by the throat, demanding escape, while she stood perfectly composed beneath the cold laboratory lamps. Then Zumina indicated Phyllis, unconscious on the floor, and explained that drugs had emptied her of Earth, Thomas, and marriage. The words broke his fury, yet Zumina calmly invited him to kill her rather than force her submission. His fingers tightened, but her fearless stillness made violence useless, and Thomas slowly released her. Abandoning threats, he begged for pity, not for himself, but for the helpless woman whose past she had stolen. Zumina's expression shifted. From her sparse garments, she produced the lost cartridges, and escape became possible at its cruelest price. Amused by the mercy Thomas had won from her, Zumina studied him as though newfound courage made him a rare specimen. "Your foolish mind fascinates me," she said, promising the transit car could return them to Earth within an hour. Phyllis stirred, opened her blue eyes, and regarded Thomas as an unfamiliar gentleman. Phyllis's mother's ring meant nothing to her. Thomas's stricken face awakened neither tenderness nor recognition. When Zumina approached, however, Phyllis showed no terror. Even her memories of laboratories and threatened vivisection had lost their sting. Thomas felt the loss like an amputation, then mastered himself. Amnesia had freed her, and he would not demand her suffering back. He met Phyllis's cautious gaze gently, accepted Zumina's offer, and prepared them for the deadly daylight road to the Venus Pyramid. With the rebellion's final assault shaking Venus, Zumina hurried Thomas and Phyllis toward the only path that remained. She fitted them with dark glasses and cooling headgear, then secured the metallic coverings against murderous heat. They stepped into daylight, where the blinding white sun burned above violet moss and colossal flowers. Thomas kept beside the bewildered Phyllis, shielding her as Zumina led them across the emerald road toward the Venus Pyramid. They reached the Venus Pyramid through the glare. Behind them, Venus City convulsed in a tower of fire. Domes and tunnels vanished together, and the ground rolled beneath their feet, while blazing debris stained the sky. Zumina watched without flinching and declared, "The Sutan-Ra Empire is ended." With every other road destroyed, the three turned urgently toward the waiting transit car. Reaching the transit car was not escape. The victorious Thotian held its surrounding electrical field like an invisible cage. Blue fire crawled over the metal fittings, every renewed pulse locking the silent mechanism while winged figures crowded the scuttles. Zumina, composed under their grasp, said, "They spared me because I seemed concerned for you. Touch nothing, Thomas, until my signal." Thomas set one trembling hand upon the lever, watching Zumina rather than the threatening shapes beyond the glass. Her finger moved. Fear delayed him by a fraction, and he pulled after the appointed instant. The transit car convulsed in an electrical blast, hurling Thomas against Phyllis as Zoomina fell, and darkness erased Venus before any of them could know whether the late lever had carried them home or killed them. The shock resolved not in death, but in wind, sunlight, and the clean, breathable air of Earth. Thomas awoke against the padded wall of the transit car, stiff and dazed after nearly 20 hours of unconsciousness. Beside him, Phyllis stirred in her modest dress, while Zoomina rose with brick-red composure and adjusted her dark glasses. Thomas forced open the door and stared across a vast golden desert beneath an impossibly blue sky. They had landed upon the summit of the Great Pyramid, with tiny figures moving far below among the sands. On the car's outer boards, fresh paint proclaimed "Plumber's Pills," absurdly familiar, and more convincing to Thomas than the desert itself. Thomas drew one grateful breath, then watched Zoomina, uncertain whether she meant to remain, threaten them, or finally set them free. Earth's wind swept the Great Pyramid, and Zoomina's cool appraisal of Thomas no longer held the claim of captor over captive. "Our experiment is concluded," she said with an unreadable inclination of her brick-red face. "Though perhaps yours is only beginning." Thomas demanded that she restore Phyllis, but Zoomina merely turned her dark glasses towards the small woman, who watched him with courteous alarm. For once, anger could not master helplessness. He lowered his voice and asked whether Phyllis had been harmed. Zoomina answered that Phyllis was safe, stepped into the transit car, and with one last enigmatic smile, vanished as silently as she had first arrived. Beneath the open sky, Thomas stood beside his living wife, facing a task no escape could solve. He must become worthy of a stranger's freely given love. From the Great Pyramid, Thomas brings Phyllis into familiar London and the formidable safety of his father's home. Thomas's father hears of Venus, Thothian rebels, and instantaneous travel, then declares the whole account feverish nonsense. Yet his skepticism softens when he studies Phyllis, pale and bewildered, still wearing Phyllis's mother's ring. He asks no proof from her. Instead, he offers shelter, respect, and the protection of the plumber name. Thomas, once accustomed to having every difficulty purchased away, finds this practical mercy humbling. His father will even arrange a lawful London wedding, but only if Phyllis herself desires it. For the first time, Thomas does not argue, boast, or plead. He simply waits beside her. Safety and legitimacy are now theirs, but the marriage can truly begin again only through Phyllis's free choice. In the ordinary months that followed, Thomas gave Phyllis what danger had never taught him to give: time. He courted her without claiming the vanished marriage, answering every doubt honestly and asking for no gratitude. Slowly she recognized the devoted man before her, not the frightened youth he remembered with shame. When Thomas asked again, Phyllis smiled and said, "I cannot remember loving you, but I know that I do." At their London wedding, Phyllis's mother's ring returned to her hand, while Thomas's father watched with proud, practical satisfaction. Thomas made no grand speech. His steady gaze promised that whatever memory had erased, patience would rebuild. Years later, their happy home proved the promise true. Love had lost its map, crossed darkness, and still found its way home.